Hello, I'm Carol Carter. My role in the REACH project has been to work with our project liaison officers, our 3 nurses, who've been working within the residential aged care facilities who participated in the project over the period of the project. What we've been doing together is conducting workshops with staff within the facilities. We've conducted altogether about 26 workshops, and the workshops have lasted up until about 2 hours. And what we're going to be presenting to you today are those parts of the workshops that the staff in the facilities seem to find the most relevant and most helpful for them. We learned a lot from them when we were doing the workshops. They were very engaged and assisted us a lot by giving us a lot of feedback. Recapping briefly on the objectives of the REACH project that are most relevant to our role in the project. We called it the ABC, and the A stands for awareness. And we're talking about awareness and recognition among healthcare staff in residential aged care facilities. Firstly, that advanced dementia is a terminal illness. Secondly, awareness of the signs and symptoms that indicate that a person is moving into the palliative stage of the condition. And thirdly, awareness of the potential barriers and challenges to initiating, facilitating and enacting end-of-life discussions with residents with dementia and their families. The B stands for building strategies and skills to address those barriers and challenges, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that in our presentation today. And the C is for confidence. Confidence in their ability, the ability of staff, your ability to recognise end of life and to care holistically, and willingness to implement an end of life, a life management plan. Now, life management planning. This is a term that you'd be familiar with the process, but let's look at it a little bit more closely. We've been talking a lot with staff in facilities about life management planning, and particularly about life management agreements. So we're talking about planning that's both formal and informal. Life management planning is the whole spectrum of looking at the best treatment options and the most preferred treatment options for any resident and the family. Life management agreements is the formal documentation of people's preferences for end of life. So what do we think are the advantages of having clear life management agreements? The first thing is, obviously, it makes a person's end-of-life preferences very clear and very specific. It also reduces the stress for families. They can feel secure knowing that the preferences of their loved one will be enacted, that the plan is clear, in place and will be followed. It makes for staff the treatment path clear, and what that can do is prevent or certainly reduce crisis decision-making about treatment. It can also, in the long run, if for instance a resident or the family of a resident chooses no active treatment, it can reduce distressing and unnecessary visits to accident and emergency. Now, in order to be able to facilitate life management planning, what we're talking about staff engaging in is what we call end-of-life conversations. If life management agreements were mandatory in an ideal world, then a lot of what we're talking about today would be a much, much easier process. Currently, they're not. When we talked with staff in facilities, there was almost universal agreement that life management agreements are a really good thing, and for all the reasons that we've already mentioned. Nobody disagreed with that. Our question then is, if everyone agrees that they're really useful and the benefits are clear, how is it that there's only a very small proportion of residents in aged care facilities who do have formal life management agreements in place? This is a question that was a major question for us in this research. Formal life, I'll speak for a moment about what we mean when we say formal and informal end-of-life conversations. We mean by formal conversations when a family sits down with the relevant people in a facility and develop a formal life management agreement. That's formalised, that's documented, that everyone's in agreement with, and that's put in place. Informal end-of-life conversations are all those conversations that all staff might have with the resident if they have capacity, but certainly with families, that lead up to a point where a formal conversation might take place. Let's talk for a moment about our exploration of how it is that there aren't more agreements in place, and that really what we're doing now in facilities is a kind of catch-up, because it's looking at all of those residents in facilities who don't have agreements and looking at what might be needed to help them, to help facilitate that process. Now, in our research, we came up with a whole lot of explanations for what might be the reasons that there aren't more life management agreements. And we developed a kind of model from the literature, from research, from conversations that had already taken place, and we brought this model to discuss in our workshops with staff in facilities. And what we found was we had an enormous amount of agreement that the kinds of things that staff in facilities were telling us and that were talking with us about as being the barriers and challenges for them fitted very much with the research that we'd already found. So let's for a moment talk through what some of those barriers and challenges are. And as we talk about it, I'd like you to think about it and think how this applies to you in the facility where you work. Which of these barriers that we came up with might be relevant to you, which ones not so much, not applying to you. So you'll see on your screen that we've developed what we call a 3-facet model about end-of-life conversations. Now, the 3 facets of the model relate to the 3 parts of developing a life management agreement. Firstly, initiating the agreement, that is, bringing it up in the first place. The hard part, beginning to have the conversation. Facilitating the life management agreement is when you actually sit down with the resident if they have capacity, or if they don't, with the family. So sitting down and actually developing a formal agreement and documenting it and putting it into place, putting it on the record. The third part is then enacting that agreement, that plan, so that as a resident's condition may start to deteriorate, the preferences become relevant, and that's when you're enacting the preferences that the person has identified. So looking through what we found to be the barriers, let's start with the first one. And this came up a lot in our workshops with staff, and it's probably the first one that they were most easily able to identify, and that is what we call systemic problems within the system that make it hard. Those kinds of difficulties within the system we found were things like, well, the first one, the most readily identified by everyone, is time, lack of time. Staff in facilities, you know this yourself, are very busy, very time poor. So having the time to have these conversations was the first one that was identified. Secondly, there was often conversation about role differentiation. Whose role is it? Whose place is it to have these conversations? Thirdly, it was often about getting cooperation from other people who are within the system, other people who are working with the resident. Not necessarily in the facility, but sometimes also other medical people outside the facility. The second one that we identified were emotions. Now, staff were pretty readily able to identify this one amongst families when they're talking about how do you initiate a conversation with families and emotions that come up for families. They less quickly, but eventually did identify where these emotions came up within themselves. Barriers that prevented them being able to initiate a conversation. Emotions we're talking about. So we're talking about emotions such as anxiety, fear, grief, and emotions such as, of course, sadness, frustration and feelings of helplessness. We also found that things such as personal beliefs and values and morals were one of the barriers. Now, these kinds of beliefs would relate to people's beliefs about death, beliefs about what it's appropriate to talk to someone else about or not. And this applied both to families as well as to staff. We then talked about communication skills, particularly for staff, their lack of confidence sometimes in their skills to initiate these conversations. We are going to be talking some more in this presentation about identifying the skills that you might need and building those skills. And the counterproductive beliefs that people might hold are beliefs about what it means to introduce a topic about life management, that it might take away hope from people, that talking about palliation, for instance, and talking about end of life is sometimes akin to hastening end of life. And the last one, we're talking about knowledge limitations, and particularly knowledge limitations about what life management agreements are. All of these barriers that applied to, or almost all these barriers that applied to the first part of the three-facet model, the initiating the conversation, equally applied to the second facet, which was facilitating. So if you think about all of those, transfer them across to the time when you're actually talking about sitting down with the resident and family and developing the life management agreement, all those same barriers may apply. An additional one that came up we're aware of was cultural issues. This came up in some facilities more than others, obviously because some facilities were located in areas that had greater cultural diversity than others. But cultural sensitivity certainly had an influence on people's ability to address the life management agreements. That again, there are some things you don't talk about or some things you don't plan for. So it's all, that was one that we're aware of too. If we move across to our third facet, which is enacting, that is, the life management agreement might be in place, and the time comes when you need to start enacting the preferences that are identified and made specific in the life management agreement. And one that came up there repeatedly was possibly fear of consequences. If I'm going to enact the preferences that are stated in this life management agreement, there may be unfortunate consequences for me, particularly if there's not someone in authority I can quickly check this out with. Am I going to be in trouble if I enact a preference, for instance, that states no active treatment? And the kind of trouble might be that people might, at a crucial time, at a time of high emotion, might forget that these are the preferences that were identified and not be happy with, for instance, no active treatment. There's also clearly a fear of potential litigation. So when we discussed all of these, they made a lot of sense to people in facilities, and as I said, they brought up a lot of these themselves. Something else that we talked with staff in our second round of workshops about was how it might actually take place within an aged care facility, how the introduction and the process of developing a life management agreement might work. Now, I'm going to talk you through a little flow chart that we developed as a result of having our conversations with staff. And while I do this, it'll be good if you think about where in this process you might find yourself. Now, might you find that a particular part of it, no, I wouldn't be involved in that part of it, but I might be involved in that part. Now, I'm not asking you to think about what you do now, but potentially what you might be involved in, because one of the things we're very aware of is that, particularly regarding informal conversations with families, staff in facilities actually had a much greater role than they at first might identify to us. Staff might say, no, it's only the RMs who have those conversations, we don't do it. But the more we talked, the more we found that other staff, care staff, are often very involved with the families and know the families very well And the families often feel very comfortable with them, that they know this is a person who cares for their family member and knows their family member well. And they might be a person who's very likely to identify a point at which a family member might be open to having this conversation and be able to move it on. So just talking you through how a process might work in a facility. We'll begin with the question, has the resident, if they have capacity, or has the family discussed with you or others their wish for future life management? Now, if the answer is yes, then the next question is, so then has a life management agreement been completed? If the answer to that is yes, we're going really well here. So the next step is to get the details, is to check to ensure that the plan is still current, that it's still expressing the preferences that would be the resident's actual wishes. And if all of that is still current, then you move down to making sure that it is regularly reviewed and that the currency of it is ensured on a regular basis. What we're talking about here is that it isn't enough just to have a life management agreement in place and in a patient's notes. It regularly needs to be reviewed very consciously, very actively, to make sure it's still a living document, that everyone is still in agreement that these are the preferences that are wanted. Now, the ways in which this might happen, this varies from facility to facility. In some, there are regular clinical currency meetings or regular case discussions, and at those, the life management agreement can come out, be checked and put back in the records, making sure that everyone is still aware of what it says. So, coming back to, again, this part of the flowchart, this is the question, has anyone discussed life management agreement? And if the answer is yes, but the answer to this question, has a life management agreement been completed? If the answer there is, well, no, it hasn't, then we come across here. And the question, or what is then suggested, is then it's probably important to start thinking about a life management agreement. Now, it would be nice if a person says, yes, what a good idea. And then if they're all agreeable to that, then it's referred to the appropriate staff member to start negotiating the agreement. The negotiation happens, the plan is completed, and again, it comes down here to make sure it's regularly reviewed. Okay, so popping back over here to this part of the chart, if the answer to this question here, has a life management agreement been completed? No, but the wishes have been recorded in the resident's notes, still not good enough. It needs then still to be referred across here to think about a life management agreement and then continue on down through this path. Now, what if this question is asked, has anyone discussed life management planning? And the answer is no. Then again, we follow down this part of the flowchart. If the answer is no, it hasn't happened, and if it's then suggested, well, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about it. And if they say, yes, what a good idea, well, then your path is easy. Again, you come down and follow this path down to the bottom. However, what you'll be well aware of is that often it's not that easy. That if you're thinking about, if you reach this stage, it's probably important to start thinking about a life management agreement. And if the answer there is no, not prepared for this yet, I'm not ready to start having this conversation, and if there is resistance, then this is when it gets a bit tricky, and when, as we'll talk about later, it's the role of staff to start using their skills to help move this along. So at this point in the plan, you would move down to here. If they're not ready yet, then you introduce something like one of the little dementia booklets that we've recommended to you, that is something that you can give to the family to take away and read, familiarise themselves more with the signs and symptoms of dementia, about what they can expect, and make a time for them to come back and start having the conversation seriously. So it would be this step here, introducing a booklet, referring to the appropriate staff member to start negotiating with the family to develop a life management agreement. Developing the agreement and then back down to here. the other things that came up in workshops that staff actually found very, very helpful, particularly in relation to this part of the process. When families are finding it difficult to move forward to the next step in life management planning. Something else we talked about with staff in the facilities was this process of assisting, particularly families of residents, to move through this process of thinking about life management planning for their loved one. It's such a difficult topic, and it's very important and very helpful for staff to understand what might be occurring that influences the resistance or the willingness of family members to engage in end-of-life conversations and to engage in the process of end-of-life planning. A model that we looked at that many people have found very helpful is a model called the stages of change. This is part of what's called a trans-theoretical model that was introduced back in the early 1980s by people called Prochaska and Di Clemente. Now, stages of change can be applied to a whole range of areas that involve change in people. Now, we're applying it particularly to the changes in readiness of family members. Now, it's a 5-stage model, and the first stage of the model is called pre-contemplation. Pre-contemplation means a person not being the slightest bit ready to move forward with change, and quite possibly not even being aware of the need to do so. So pre-contemplation means nowhere near ready yet. The second stage is called contemplation, and contemplation means a person becomes aware of the needs for change. So in the situation we're talking about, the family members may become aware of the importance and the need to develop a life management plan or a life management agreement, but actually not be ready yet. So recognition that it needs to happen, but I'm not ready to go there yet. The third stage is called preparation. Now, in this stage, people recognise the need for change, recognise the need to move forward with this, and they actually are ready to begin planning for it. So they're in active preparation. They may, for instance, be talking with other family members about what the residents' treatment preferences might be. They're prepared to make a time to sit down and have a meeting to go ahead and develop a plan. The fourth stage is called action, and action is when it's actually occurring. In the situation we're talking about with life management agreements, that would mean sitting down with the relevant staff in the facility and developing the agreement, making it happen. Now, you might think that's all that's needed. The plan's done, everything's good. But remember that very last stage we talked about when we were looking at the flow chart. The fifth stage then is maintenance. And maintenance means, in this instance, making sure that the life management agreement remains current, that it is still expressing the active wishes of the resident, or at least the family's best interpretation of what the wishes of the resident would be for life, their end-of-life management, their treatment preferences. So maintenance is extremely important, because without maintenance, what might happen is that a person might lose their readiness, lose their nerve, if you like. And sometimes when a resident's condition begins to deteriorate, it might happen that they actually slip backwards in the stages of change, sometimes all the way right back to pre-contemplation, and you need to work with them to bring them back down to action and maintenance. Now, if you think about this in terms of people that you know, perhaps residents, and very often families of residents, I'm sure you can bring to mind people that you know and recognise where they might be within those stages of change. We're going to move on now to talk about communication skills. Now, in our second round of workshops with staff in facilities, we spent a fair bit of time talking about the actual skills that they might develop that will give them more confidence to be able to have end-of-life conversations with family members. Obviously with residents if they have capacity, but if not, with family members. and looking at these communication skills to then feel more confident to be able to have the conversations. In the package that you receive with your DVD, you'll have a handout that goes through a whole range of communication skills in more detail that we talked about with staff in the workshops, and we're going to summarise them here for you. To begin with, we talked about actual skills. I'll talk about the two aspects to what we're going to be presenting to you here. And the first is the actual skills that you use, and the second part is actually some words that you might use, because we found a lot of staff in workshops said to us, that's all very well, but when it comes down to it, I don't actually know what words to use. So we talked a bit about words, and we'll come to those in a moment. Firstly, just to summarise what we talked about in terms of skills. We talked about first being aware, the skills of what we call attending skills. And the first of these is awareness, and that just means instead of being distracted when you're talking with someone, let's imagine you're wanting to have a conversation with a family member. The first thing is to make sure that you are fully present in the moment and that you are paying attention, that you're not distracted doing other things and with two things on your mind, that you're giving a person your full attention and you're aware, you're in the here and now, you're fully attending. The second one is paying attention to aspects like posture, distance, and appropriate eye contact. These are all things that help to keep you in the moment. The second aspect of these skills is what we call following skills. And again, it is about paying attention, but it's about tracking what's going on for the other person that you're having a conversation with. Firstly, we're talking about active listening. Now, active listening means being aware of the difference between just hearing or really listening, actively listening. And when you're actively listening, you're actually speaking less and listening more. We talk about what we call verbal encouragers. Now, verbal encouragers are those little indicators when a person is talking with you that let them know you're still listening and paying attention. And they're sometimes physical things and sometimes verbal things. Things like yes, and I'll tell you something interesting that's come up recently in research that I heard just the other day, was that in comparing male and female conversations, the researchers actually found that women use these verbal encouragers more than men do. They didn't go into a whole lot of explanation about why this is so, but I tend to think it's because of socialisation. Women tend to be a little bit more encouraged and have more permission to engage in the to and fro of conversation, of sharing of emotions and feelings. It's something that is more acceptable socially. Men, less so. They just listen quietly. But verbal encourages those little nods, paying attention. Interpreting body language means paying attention to what's going on for the other person while you're having a conversation. And congruence means paying attention to whether what a person is saying and what they're doing physically while they're saying it are giving the same message. If, for instance, you're beginning to talk with someone to initiate an end-of-life conversation and they might be saying to you something that indicates, yes, I'm ready to have this conversation, but actually their body language is something like this, then you might figure something's not quite right, something's inconsistent in the message I'm getting from them. We're going to talk in a moment about another one of the following skills, which is using open and closed questions appropriately. So watch this space, we're going to talk a little more about that in a moment. But also using silence. Attentive silence means being able to stop talking for a moment, allow silence, because sometimes out of silence a person becomes aware of what they're feeling and thinking, and it makes it easier for them to express it. We've also talked about what are called reflecting skills. Reflecting skills basically are about what you are giving back to the person when they're trying to tell you something, when they're trying to have a conversation with you. And reflecting skills involve reflecting different aspects of the message a person is giving you. Reflecting feelings if a person is indicating to you that they're feeling distressed, or they're feeling anxious, or they're feeling frustrated, it's about letting them know, yeah, I can see that this feels frustrating for you, or this must be hard for you, or this must make you feel sad, if what you're getting from them is sadness. Reflecting content means reflecting back to a person that you've heard what it is they've said. So the content of their message. If they're saying to you, I'm not ready yet, you can reflect even those exact words to them. I understand that you're not ready yet. It's all part of helping a person feel heard. Elaborating means taking what a person has said and feeding it back to them, plus a little more. It might be something like, I understand that you're not ready yet, and you're suggesting maybe you'll be ready to talk about this perhaps in a week or two. So it's adding a little more to what they've said. Paraphrasing and summarising similarly are feeding back to a person what they've said, but pulling it all together for them, and again this is all part of helping them feel heard. Moving on now to talking about actual words to use. As I said, this is something that came up often for staff in facilities. Sometimes I just don't know what are the words to use. So we spent a lot of time discussing this in workshops, and I'm summarising for you a couple of the aspects of words that staff found quite helpful. I'm going to talk first about using open questions and using closed questions, because there is actually a place for using open questions, but there's also a place for using closed questions. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's imagine that you're talking with the family of a resident who is just beginning to show signs of deterioration in their condition. Now, you can tell that perhaps the family member is becoming quite distressed about this, and you think that this is a time when it's important to start talking with them about treatment preferences and about moving forward and about what might be going to happen to them, but you're sensing that this is a hard process for them. If you were to use an open question, such as, what do you think is happening? Then you're not putting them under too much pressure. That's a very open question. They could go anywhere with that question, compared to, for instance, a closed question where you might say to them, do you think your mum is deteriorating? Now, asking that closed question might, for instance, be rather threatening. It's a bit too much for them to take at the moment, and so they might, in a moment of resistance and panic, they might come back and say, no, I think she's just having a bad day. Whereas if you leave the question open, you're leaving it for them not to feel threatened and not to need to be defensive, but to say, I don't think she's as good as she has been. Okay. Now, looking at a couple of other examples of open and closed questions. Now, in this instance, we might say that a closed question might be more helpful. Now, imagine a situation where, for instance, a resident's condition might be deteriorating, and they might have, for instance, a life management agreement in place. Now, if they've taken a turn for the worse and you say something to the family member like, what do you want to do? Then the potential is that they might feel, if I say, well, I want them to stay here and be cared for, people might think that they're being uncaring. But if you were to imagine asking a closed question there, such as, now we could send her to hospital, or we could keep her comfortable here. Would you prefer that? Now that's a very closed question, but you're giving options. But by closing the question a little, you're making it possible. It's almost as though you're giving permission for the family member to stick with the plan and say, okay, yes, keep her comfortable here. That would be what I'd wish for. You're allowing them to go in that direction, whereas the open question in that instance might not be as helpful. Now, there is a third kind of question that we can think of as a kind of guided open question. Now, the open question, for instance, in a situation where you're beginning to talk with a family about life management planning, you're talking about it's time for us to sit down and start developing a plan, developing an agreement. But you can tell that this is feeling quite confronting. The family's having a little difficulty shifting, if you like, from perhaps the pre-contemplative to the contemplative stage in the stages of change, or from contemplative to preparation. Now, in this instance, you could ask an open question, which is engaging with them, it's addressing their feelings, that's all a good thing. So you might say, how are you feeling? Or you might say, are you feeling confronted by this process? Now, if you say it that way, a person might feel like denying that they're feeling confronted, because that they might think, people often get defensive if you suggest to them that they might find something confronting. But let's check out what a guided open question might be. Now, you're leaving it open because you're asking a person, how do you feel? But you're closing it in a little bit. You're guiding them in a certain direction by saying, for instance, some people find this process confronting to begin with. How are you feeling about it at the moment? Now, again, what you're doing is you're giving permission for a person to say, yes, I am finding it a little confronting. So just some examples of how to use open and closed questions in a way that's helpful. Another aspect of communication skills that we looked at in workshops was looking at how you can change the whole meaning and sense of a sentence from perhaps being a little confronting to helping a person move forward in a process of cooperation. And that's just by changing one word in a sentence. We're looking at just changing the word but to the word and. Now, I'll give you an example to show you how it can change the meaning or the impact of a sentence. Let's take a fairly general sentence like, I've looked at the information you gave me, but I have a few questions I want to ask. Now, using the word but there suggests a little bit of challenge, a little bit of, there's something negative about this. Whereas if you just switch that but to and say, I've looked at the information you gave me and I have a few questions I want to ask, changes the whole sense to more a sense of this is possible, cooperation. A couple of other general examples. I got your invitation to come and have a talk on Tuesday, but I have my class on Tuesday. Now, the immediate implication you get from that sentence is there's a problem here. We've got a problem on our hands, I probably can't do Tuesday. Whereas you switch that but to and, which is, I got your invitation to come and have a talk on Tuesday and I have my class on Tuesday. It's much more, okay, we need to talk about this because we need to look for a solution. Again, it's that sense of inclusion and cooperation rather than negation. The word but tends to sometimes negate what came before or suggest something problematic, whereas and suggests cooperation. Another general example is, you like the window open, but I like it closed. So we've got a problem here, whereas and you like the window open and I like it closed, again suggests where do we go from here. Now, a couple of examples I can give you where we're applying it to the topic that we've been talking about today, about life management agreement planning. And this one might particularly apply to people who are in the pre-contemplative stage of the stages of change. So here's an example. Imagine you're talking with a family about moving forward to some life management planning. I recognise that this is quite a confronting process, but the sooner we begin thinking about it, the more time you'll have to get it as good as it can possibly be. So the but there tends to imply we don't care that much that this is confronting to you, we want you to move forward. Whereas if you change that to and, I recognise this is quite a confronting process and the sooner we begin thinking about it, and so on. It implies, again, we're doing something together here. Just a couple of other examples, again, suggesting possibly the people who might be in the pre-contemplation stage. It might be, for instance, Your dad is in quite good health at the moment, but we often find this is a good time to begin thinking about ongoing life management. You switch that to and. Your dad's in quite good health at the moment, and we often find this is a good time to begin thinking about ongoing life management. Again, see the difference. Shifting it forward rather than saying, don't care that he's in good health at the moment. We're saying, yes, this is all about cooperation and moving forward. And here's a simple one, but again a powerful one for changing the but to and. You want the best for her, but we do too. The but suggests you think we don't. But if you change that but to and, you want the best for her, and we do too, suggests we're in this together, we're a team. An example that might apply to people who are in the contemplative stage, in the stages of change. If you think about this one, you may have mixed feelings about this, but you may find it becomes a little less confronting as we go through the process. Again, switch that but to and. You may have mixed feelings about this, and you may find it becomes a little less confronting as we go through the process. It kind of validates their right to have mixed feelings. In your package, your workshop materials, you'll find there are a range of other examples that we've given. I'd like you to have a look at them, play with them, see how it makes a difference. And think about examples in your own life, because we did a lot of this when we were working with staff, is just trying out changing the but to an and in a whole range of examples and situations and see how it makes a difference. Now, if you're thinking about more words that you might want to use just in general, we're not just talking about switching and for but or using open and closed question, there's another handout that will be in your package with your DVD that was developed by some of our project liaison officers, where they give a range of words that you might use, sentences that you might use that help you introduce the topic of life management planning to people who are in different stages of the stages of change. Our project liaison officers are here with me today, and I know that they had some questions that they felt commonly came up in groups in the workshops when we were talking with people. So I'll ask them. Sally, you had a question, I think.
Carol, one of the issues that often comes up with staff is how do they move ahead in conversations on end of life when the carer or family member appear to be determined not to discuss it?
Really daunting. The first thing I'd suggest is that you think about what might be occurring for the family. When they appear determined not to discuss it, it's about thinking about where they're coming from at the time. Remember the 3-facet model that we talked about that looked at all the barriers and challenges that people might be experiencing. And among those are things like emotions. They might be experiencing a range of emotions such as fear or guilt or anxiety, anticipatory grief that's getting in the way for them to move forward and confront it. They may have a range of beliefs. Think about what their beliefs might be that might be influencing their ability to move forward. I'd also suggest thinking about where in the stages of change they might be. It sounds as though if they're determined not to move forward with it, if that's your feeling, I'd think about, are they in the pre-contemplative stage of the stages of change? It sounds as though they probably are. Now, if they are, then what are the communication skills that you can use to assist them to move from pre-contemplative to the contemplative stage, and then hopefully further through the stages of change? The communication skills and the words that we've talked about today. I'd also suggest that one thing that you might do is, even if they're appearing determined not to talk about it, what if you negotiate with them at least to make an appointment and meet again? You might say, for instance, let's meet again in 2 weeks' time. Now, that gives them time to perhaps to begin to adjust to the idea. They may not keep that appointment. They may need to reschedule to a later time, but at least you're starting to put a little structure in there. And the last thing I'd say is to don't underestimate your own skills and your own knowledge. Remember that, generally speaking, you will know this family You will have a relationship with them. And remember that you actually are a skilled worker. You probably have a lot more skills than you initially recognise. And you can call on these skills to start discussing, negotiating, and understanding where the family is coming from to help them begin to reach a place where they can discuss it. Gail, you had a question.
Carol, one of the issues that was raised by the workshop participants was that they get the family to a point where they make an appointment to formalise the LMA, and then they cancel and perhaps avoid the issue. What are your suggestions there?
And actually this is very common. And despite the fact that it's very frustrating for you as a worker, it is something that's very common. I think the important thing is that there are lots of reasons for why this could happen, and it's important to think about what might be going on for families. There'd be a great deal going on for families at this stage. It's getting a little bit confronting, this is getting a little bit too real, perhaps. They're probably going through a range of emotions at this time, again thinking about what the barriers might be. And the emotions that they might be feeling are guilt, anxiety, things like a sense of anticipatory loss and grief. So understand that that's what might be going on for them in terms of emotions. And again, it could be helpful to think about where they might be in the stages of change. Now remember, we talked about the fact that sometimes what can happen is that a person might reach a certain stage in the stages of change, but they might then, when they're a little bit confronted or when they're feeling a certain range of emotions, they might actually move backwards in the stages of change. You might think they're right at preparation stage, but under stress, it might cause them to move backwards, say to contemplative. I'm not quite ready yet. So what I'd suggest also is that we've talked about a whole range of skills that you can use, and I'd remember the different skills that you can use for the different stages in the stages of change, and look at how you might encourage and assist and be understanding to them. And don't rush them. Recognise they might need to go back, but stick with them and help when the time is right to move back through the process. Again, perhaps make another appointment, but give them time. The other thing I'd suggest is think about what resources, what physical resources, reading material and so on, you might be able to give them to take away so they can, in their own time, have another think about it. Do a little bit more reading, get themselves settled again, so that hopefully they'll then come back to being ready to move forward and keep that appointment. So that brings us to the end. We've been talking about the importance of life management planning and of formal life management agreements. And we've talked about those crucial end-of-life conversations that you may engage in that can lead to the development of life management agreements, but also to enable people to feel heard and understood at this time. We've also talked about the barriers and challenges that can make it very difficult to be able to engage in these conversations, to initiating and facilitating and enacting end-of-life planning. I would encourage you to develop your skills and your confidence in being able to have these conversations, and to recognise the enormously important role that you play, this crucial role that you play in ensuring the best possible quality of life for people in the final stages of their lives. Thank you.